direct the Gardner Policy Institute. Excited to have a discussion today about government, the size of government, government growth in the federal government, state government. And we're going to have I'm going to call it sort of like a coffee, sitting over coffee kind of conversation, because we've got some of our analysts, I've got some thoughts about it, and we've got a new report coming out later today. And so welcome. And I will just mention that I have a couple of quick housekeeping items. We've disabled the share screen and audio features for all of our participants except our panelists, but we would like you to submit questions using the chat box feature. We'll have a lot of time for questions later in the hour, and Nick Thuriot, our communications director, will help facilitate that. So thank you, Nick. And with that, I'll jump in and get us started. Our topic is government growth. The Gardner Policy Institute will be releasing a report later today. The report was authored by our scholar in residence, Mike Christensen, with assistance from research associate Max Becker. Mike is going to walk us through some highlights of the report, and then we'll discuss it at length. After Mike presents some highlights, we're going to invite Phil Dean, who's our public finance senior fellow, to join us in this, I don't know if you want to call it a fireside chat or a coffee room conversation, but we're going to have a discussion about growth. It's a really interesting time. And Mike, as I turn it over to you, I was just thinking of, you and I've shared a long history together, and we've been a part of a lot of conversations about government growth. Ronald Reagan once said that, government isn't going to solve the problem, government is the problem. So he took a stand on government growth. Milton Friedman once said, keep your eye on one thing and one thing only: how much government is spending. And then I believe Bill Clinton once said the era of big government is over. And I think you've shown in your research that it's not over, but there's reasons for that. So Mike, let's turn the time over to you and let you walk through some highlights, and then I'll have some questions for you, and we'll have Phil join the conversation.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to represent the Gardner Institute, who I have great respect for. The last 2 years have been very disruptive for us all. The pandemic has changed our lives in so many ways, from working to social distancing, from working to social activities, from education to shopping, from play to travel. Not only have we had to change the way we live, but governments had to change too to deal with this vicious COVID pandemic. The federal government has worked with pharmaceutical companies to develop a vaccine. They provided billions of dollars to large companies like airlines to keep them afloat, and millions to small companies like your local restaurant. They provided aid to help individuals keep their homes and stay in their apartments. They've required mask wearing and social distancing. Such measures have created resistance from some citizens, as we all know, arguing that government is becoming too big, too authoritarian, too much involved in the lives of its citizens. They feel that this new big government is taking away their freedom of choice. We can't measure as to whether it's becoming too intrusive. That's something you'll have to decide. But we can measure government growth. And it is the purpose of this paper to do just that. So first, we will look at the federal government. Then we will look at our state government, ask ourselves if our state is following the same trend as the feds, or are we on our own path? So with that as a quick introduction, I'll show you some of the slides that are in our report. So let's start first. There we go. So let's look at government growth. This is the federal government again. U.S. expenditures, excuse me, that's not, sorry, there's the one. Federal expenditures as a percent of the gross domestic product. As you can see, if you look at the dotted line, which is kind of just the overall trend, federal expenditures relative to GDP have gone up. If you look at the solid line now, we start in 1930. Back in 1930, that was just the year after the stock market crash of 29, but before the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal began trying to get us out of the recession. And so government was very, very small, 3% of the gross domestic product. But with the New Deal coming on and attempts to try and get this nation rolling again, it jumped to 10%. And then you can see it skyrocketed to 43% to finance World War II. Wars are expensive, and the federal government made huge expenditures for weapons and soldiers and so on. And then you can see it dropped almost as dramatically at the end of the war in 1945-46. And then it went up again as the New Deal started, those programs started expanding. The Korean War hit right there, that first little bump. And then you can see from there all the way over to the mid-1990s, though the trend is slightly upward, overall, there really is almost no growth. We're at 20% in the 1950s, and we're at 20% in the mid-1990s. So a long time of relatively insignificant growth. And then you can see the spike there in the late 2000s. That was the Great Recession, as we've decided to call it. And both the Bush administration and the Obama administration had to step in to provide substantial financial support to keep our financial system from completely collapsing. Then you see the last spike, as you can see there, it dropped all the way to 31% of gross domestic product. That's the attempt of the federal government to deal with this pandemic. Enormous expenditures, as I just mentioned. The Office of Management Budget projects that once this COVID crisis is over, that federal expenditures will settle down to around 24 to 25%. So has government grown? Has the federal government grown? Yes. Has it grown dramatically? Well, it depends on your starting point. If you start in 1930, yes, but that's really an unfair comparison because in 1930, there was no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no temporary citizens for needy families. All those big social programs simply didn't exist back then. Once they were put in, as you can see, by the 1950s, we're already at 20%, and now we're going to settle in somewhere around 25%. So if you start with the 1950s and go now, which I think is a fair comparison, it has grown, but not a great deal. Now let's see how our expenditures relative to GDP compares to other nations. This is for 2018, the latest year, which we could get data for lots of nations. As you can see, United States is on the left there. And you can see only Mexico and Russia of this selection of nations spends less, has a smaller participation in the economy than does the United States. So from Australia, Argentina, Brazil, United Kingdom, Canada, Spain, Germany, Greece, Italy, and France all have larger participation in their economy as measured against GDP than is the United States. They spend more per GDP than do we. So if you look at it that way, federal government is a relatively small player in our economy relative to other nations of the world. Now that we've looked at federal government, those are two quick snapshots. We do more in the report, but that's good enough for now. Let's now look at state government and see if we compare with the federal government or if we really are on our own path. Right here, you can see Utah state government expenditures from 1989 to 2020. Back in 1989, the total state budget was $2.6 billion. And now in 2020, it's pushing $16 billion. So that's a tremendous growth, as you can see. The lines indicate which major areas are expenditures. That's not the purpose of this report. So I won't deal with other than to say that the gray area is, which is growing the fastest, you can see, are the social service programs led by the Medicaid budget, which is a federal state participation program. Now let's take those same expenditures and look at it relative to total personal income in the state of Utah. So we're not using GDP, we're using total personal income. So we're asking ourselves, how do state expenditures compare with per $1,000 of personal income in the state of Utah? And again, that's state personal income, not national personal income. And as you can see, if you take the dotted line, that's actually a downward trend. In 1989, we were spending approximately $118 per 1,000 person. Excuse me, state of Utah was spending $118 per $1,000 of personal income. That's dropped down to about $89 now. So that's a substantial drop. The red lines are each year, as you can see. But overall, state expenditures have declined and appear to continue to be declining relative to Utah's personal income. That's clearly different than the federal government. Now let's look at another measure of government growth, and that is employment. The three levels of government are federal, state, and local, and all three of those lines are at the bottom, as you can see. All three of them are declining. The federal government declined the most, but all of them, even combined, are a very small part of the thing, about 17% total. And that, now let's look at the gold line or the yellow line at the very top. What we're saying here is that private sector employment in the state of Utah has been increasing since the 1960s and continues to look like it's going to increase. So today, more people are employed in the private sector than at any time during this measurement, which goes again all the way back to 1959. More people are employed in the private sector, about 84%. So the 16% left are obviously the three levels of government. So is government growing by this measurement? Absolutely not. It's shrinking. So in conclusion, whether measured by state government expenditures per $1,000 of personal income or state and local government employees or wages, we didn't show you wages, but the trend is virtually the same as employment. Government in Utah is becoming smaller. The question then becomes, is that good news or not? For many persons, this is good news. Government is not becoming an increasing tax burden. However, if government expenditures are shrinking, and they are, as a percent of the total economy, then many wonder, in such a competitive world, if the state is investing in its citizens as much as it could. And that's the big question. That's not a question that the Gardner Institute can answer. That's a question that we have to answer on our own, individually based on our own values. But bottom line is we are on our own path. We are not following the federal government in its path for expenditures. And that is, I think, an important piece of news. With that, Natalie, I'll turn it back over to Phil and let him make his comments.
That's great. Hey, thanks, Mike. Really helpful to walk through that. And Phil, we want to welcome you to the conversation. Phil Dean is the former chief economist and state budget director in the Herbert administration. He's had several decades now of public policy work, public economics work, and is in a great position to kind of react to what Mike's just said and share some insights of your own, Phil.
Well, thanks. Appreciate that, Natalie. And it's always a good morning when I can be together with a couple of my professional mentors and friends. So it's a pleasure to join you. So I wanted to just follow up with a couple of things that kind of jump out to me as I look at what Mike's presented here and seeing the draft of his report, like I start with the premise of what does government, why does government spend money, right? I ask policymakers, I've asked them many times, how many thank you notes did you get for the taxes that you imposed? And I still have yet to get many of those. But what people do like is the government services that they receive. And so for me, one of the fundamental things that I think we need to be thinking about is, are we funding at the levels to achieve whatever policy outcomes we want to achieve? Are we achieving the The educational outcomes. Is our transportation infrastructure the way that we want it to be? And as an economist, you know, I'm going to say this, there are trade-offs there, right? When we take money out of the private sector portion of the economy and put it in the public sector portion of the economy, that means we're sacrificing something. And so all of us need to kind of think about, are we making the right sacrifices? Is it too little? Is it too much? Kind of how do those balance out? And then the other thing I'll maybe follow up with one additional thought, and it's something you mentioned, Governor Herbert, man, I have incredible respect for. He would talk a lot about education funding with this phrase, and I think it applies not only to education funding, but also to government spending more broadly. And he'd always say, it's not all about the money, but it is some about the money. And just kind of highlighting that the way that government conducts its business, whether it does so efficiently or inefficiently, that does matter. And at the same time, some basic level of resources also matters. And we need to be thinking about that and thinking about those trade-offs.
Very good. Thank you, Phil. Mike, I want to remind people to go ahead and submit questions, but Mike, let's go into some nuances in the data a little bit. And Nick or Mike, we might have to pop up this slide deck a little bit to go through this. But one of the things I noticed, Mike, when we talk about government growth is the choice of a base year really makes a big difference, right? And because the history is so filled with changes in the role of government and the demands of society, whether it's a world war or whether it's taking care of seniors in our society, but the choice of a base year has a really big difference on the conclusions you draw. And I wondered if you could comment on that. And it might make sense to bring up the federal expenditures as a percent of GDP as you do that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not important, it's crucial. If we could start, like I say on that one, if we start in 1930 and compare it to what's going on now, then you've got a government that almost looks like it's out of control. It's growing so fast, it's becoming such a huge part of the economy. But we have to keep in mind, just as Phil said, and I think Phil made a really important comment here, and that is, government is about choices. What do we spend our money on? How much do we want to spend our money on that? And where do we take that money from? We take it from business or from individuals or from property, you know, those kinds of choices are all crucial. But the huge change that, and we do talk about this in the full report, and that is government, the federal government has changed dramatically in where it spends its money. We have, as a society, made enormous decisions that have virtually changed our expenditures. In 1960, for example, when John Kennedy was president of the United States, 52% of the federal budget went to national defense. You know, 1 out of every $2 was being spent on national defense in Kennedy's administration. Today, even though that's gone from around $42 billion to over $700 billion for national defense, it is 11% of the budget. So we've gone from 66% of our budget going to national defense to 11%. That's a huge shift in our attitude. And what's replaced that supposed void? It's healthcare, it's social services, and so on. Back in Kennedy's administration, that was about 25% of the budget. It's now 66% of the budget. And so, just as you say, where you start makes a big difference, but also makes a big difference is over time, the United States has shifted in what it thinks its priorities are. And that's not new for the United States. Those same decisions have been made across the world, with modern countries looking more and more to taking care of its people through social services. Right now, Social Security and Medicare, which is a federal health insurance program for the elderly, that's all 30% of the budget right now, a little over 30% actually. So that's huge. I mean, the senior citizens of this nation are receiving about 3 out of every $10 the federal government spends.
Phil, I want to get you to have some color commentary there. You mentioned that the question you ask is, are we funding at the levels we want for the policy outcomes we desire? And Mike, who's a PhD historian, has sort of said, there's all this history that changed our choices of the policy options we want. But there's also some underlying economic and demographic things going on. And you've helped teach me this, but one of them is the notion that the rising costs of the things that government provides, education, healthcare. And I wonder if you could just kind of comment on the cost dynamics, both facing federal government and state government.
Yeah, so as you look at the different components of the economy, a lot of times spending is just compared to inflation and population growth, which is, I think, a legitimate comparison, but it doesn't fully capture the story. The government is very service intensive, where that overall inflation number is going to include both goods and services. Certainly government benefits from driving down the cost of some goods. So for example, our computers are cheaper that are bought in government than they used to be, things like that. But at the same time, there's a lot of benefit that we don't get, that we're not able to have healthcare services provided by China, like a lot of goods are provided by China. Our education services. So these very personnel intense type activities that government provides are harder to achieve efficiency, at least by outsourcing. I think there are things that government can and should do to improve its business processes, to become more efficient, to do a better job, and needs to kind of constantly be thinking about that and incorporating that into the processes that we have in government. Just, another example, you look at transportation materials, particularly that have a growth rate that's a lot higher than general inflation. And so as you look at a gas tax that's a slowly dying tax, it has some of these very significant impacts. Another, as you mentioned, healthcare services. So one of the biggest growing parts of the state budget is Medicaid. And these are healthcare services, I'll point out, largely provided by the private sector. There's some in the public sector with the university health system, but these are largely private sector providers. And it's not only government that's experiencing these healthcare cost increases, it's also throughout the private sector.
Very good. Phil, I'm going to come back to you in a minute to talk about the relationship between federal funds and state funds and our growth relationship. But Mike, I wanted to also, just for our participants, for our viewers, just talk for a minute about one of the factors that makes government big that's not really attractive, not desirable. And where I really started thinking about this in the November 20th cover story of The Economist magazine, the title was "The Triumph of Big Government." And then they have their essays and whatnot about it. But they point to these reasons for government growth. And I just want to read you one of the statements from there and ask you to comment on it. It says, inertia and mission creep make government hard to pare back. Voters and lobbyists who benefit from a regulation or item of spending have every reason to work hard at preserving it, whereas the many taxpayers who pay for pork barrels have better things to do than petition politicians to get rid of them. The bureaucrats in charge want to defend their turf and careers. When a program fails, its supporters say it could still succeed if it only were given more money. Now that's sort of a colorful, economist-like writing, but I do want to acknowledge that, regulations and government inefficiencies, institutional failures, even corruption at times are a problem in government.
They are, and I don't disagree with that comment by The Economist at all. I think special interest groups and their professional lobbyists do have significant power and influence in the decision-making process. So I don't disagree with that. I would just not put, I think we just have to be careful about putting too much weight into that thing and saying they're the cause of all government growth, because I don't believe that. We've changed, the biggest change in, at least at the federal, well, and at the state level too, because as Phil always reminds me, about a fourth of all the state expenditures come from the federal government anyway in the form of grants, mostly for Medicaid. But there's enormous pressure on government to spend on programs that people like. I mean, Social Security is an incredibly popular program. It doesn't need, 500 special lobbyists back there campaigning for it. They've got, I don't think they have anywhere near 500, but they've got lobbyists back there always fighting for it. I think it would survive anyway. We like Social Security. The people on it love it. The children of those people love it too, because it's helping their parents get through life without as much help they may have otherwise needed. Same thing with Medicare. It's well received. Those are two very popular programs. And so it's not just lobbyists that are the cause of this. I just believe as a society, we have made a conscious decision that we want to take care of certain groups of our society. How large those groups should be and how much help they should get are clearly debated every year. Should we expand Medicaid? Well, and that's exactly what Obamacare did. It expanded. We reduced the number of people without health insurance in this country by expanding Medicaid. That's the main reason for its growth. And I don't think it's going to change. I mean, the Republicans have tried hard to get rid of Obamacare, and they failed every time. Obamacare is becoming popular. And as Phil pointed out, and I think it's important to point out, often this is called socialism or something. All Obamacare does is require the private sector to cover more people. I mean, through Medicaid, it's a federal program, but Medicaid is actually executed by the private sector for the most part through the healthcare system. So I just think we just need to be careful not to spend too much, put too much blame on special interests and lobbyists.
Phil, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to go ahead and comment on my sort of provocative statement from The Economist.
Yeah, so I worked in government in 2 states over, several decades. And government has challenges executing. And part of that relates to government essentially being a monopoly, having this power of coercion that unlike the private sector, where you kind of have to convince people, at least in competitive markets, to purchase your goods or services, government needs to have different incentive structure, and politics provide at least some of that incentive structure. But there's also like real challenges. There's never enough money. That's something you learn as budget director. It doesn't matter if there's a little bit of new revenue, if there's a lot of new revenue, there's never enough revenue to do everything that everyone wants. And so you kind of have to focus on what are these key things and focus on what are these key outcomes that we want to achieve. And it's a hard thing, right? When there's not agreement. That's why we have the processes that we have. But there's all of the political piece. There's the government not having the same challenges. At the same time, I will say the private sector has the benefit of like knowing at the end of the day whether they were successful or not, based on their profitability. And so in some ways that's easier. In some ways it's harder, but in some ways it's easier, where in government we sometimes don't really know exactly. We know nebulously, we know directionally kind of what's intended to be accomplished, but sometimes we don't know specifically enough. We don't measure ourselves the right way.
Yeah, yeah, well said, Phil. I can see some questions are coming in. I'll just remind you to go ahead and submit some more. We'll turn to those in just a second here. Phil, let's stay with you. I mentioned that I was going to ask you to help explain the relationship between federal and state spending and how the federal government spending influences state spending. I think it would be helpful for you to describe that because, you know, the conclusion of the report from Mike and Max is basically that Utah's on a different growth path and trajectory than the federal government. Am I getting that right, Mike?
Yes.
Yeah, and so knowing that, how does the federal government influence our state spending?
Yeah, so as Mike mentioned, particularly through social programs. So, you know, federal government does some of that just on their own and kind of directly with citizens, but much of what the federal government does, they do in partnership with states in particular and also with local governments. And so as you look at total spending, you see this growing share of spending that comes from the federal government. And this last year is an example of that. And if you look historically at this data, you see these trends where it kind of ramps up during recessions as there's additional Medicaid funding, additional sometimes stimulus money, like with ARA, like with the CARES Act, like with the ARPA Act that comes directly to states. And then you'll see it kind of come back down somewhat over time, although it's often doesn't come all the way back down to where it was prior to the recession. So some of that's intentional, and we're at kind of one of those peaks, as this graph here shows at the federal level. Significant chunks of that did come to states, and so you're seeing a similar increase in terms of federal government spending as a share of the economy. But even with beyond social service programs, federal government helps to fund education. Federal government helps to fund transportation, some of these big programs. And it's one of these challenges, you know, for me, as I look at the federal government, as someone who had to submit a balanced budget to the legislature every single year, you know, it's one thing to not balance your budget during bad economic times. It's a different thing to not balance your budget kind of over the business cycle. And that's something that the federal government has failed to do, seems to have no direction of moving toward that. And to me, that's like part of the challenge is, I think, whenever, hopefully it's not a major crisis, but maybe it is a major crisis, forces that, that's going to have impacts on states. Like that's going to impact programs that the federal government is funding in states. And I think that's something important for state governments to keep in mind, just to make sure that as the federal government at least somewhat restructures over time, to be prepared for some of those impacts that are likely coming states' way.
Yeah, I think that's really well said.
Yeah, I'll just say parenthetically, Mike and Phil, that one of the great frustrations I have is that during the last expansion, which was the longest in US history, that we didn't make more progress on the federal debt. Yeah. To your point, Phil, that it's one thing to borrow during a downturn, but we don't need to be borrowing when we're thriving. Mike, this question's come in, and it is designed for you because I know a little bit about your research interests. So the questioner says the United States has become much more urban than rural during the time period discussed. Is there any research on how government spending is impacted by this shift from rural to urban? Large urban areas are arguably more expensive to maintain and invest in, given infrastructure and other needs. So
that's an excellent question. I think the answer is that again, it's the shift in where government is spending its money, and so are urban areas more expensive? Probably. I mean, again, the federal government spends money where the people live. That's really the bottom line. And if you've got, for example, here we are in Salt Lake County, just it's a square miles, it's a small county relative in the state. Of our 29 counties, one of the smallest. Yet it has over 1 million people in it. Well, if you looked at federal tax dollars, where would they be going? The majority of federal tax dollars, and I don't know this is a measurement, but I'm sure are coming in to Salt Lake County, particularly through like Medicaid. We wouldn't use Medicare because that's a program, as Phil indicated, goes directly to the people from the federal government. Medicaid is a federal state program. The state's required to match that to get the money in the first place. And so, yeah, a lot of Medicaid dollars are being spent in Salt Lake County, a lot more than in, Kanab or other of our small counties, Rich County, for example, and so on. But I don't want to indicate that our rural counties don't get help. There is substantial aid going there as well. There's just different kind of aid. Our rural counties are poor counties for the most part. So on a per capita basis, I suspect that they're getting more Medicaid, more temporary assistance for needy families, more supplemental nutrition programs, and so on a per capita basis. In total, obviously, they would be almost minuscule. But so it varies. But I think the questioner has a really good point, and that is government spends the money where the people live, and we're a very urban state. As you know, Natalie, about 80% of our population lives between Ogden and Spanish Fork, basically, and so that's where the vast majority of federal dollars are going to go. Yes,
that's great. We have a person who's asked, and go ahead, Phil. Go ahead.
Can I follow up on that just really quick? So I want to share. Is that showing up for you? This.
Yeah, there you go.
So this is, I pulled this infographic, which I think is really informative for 2019, intentionally to try to kind of separate some of the kind of long-term structural issues from the pandemic related issues. And so this is by the Congressional Budget Office that I think does a really good job like explaining the federal budget. But look down there at the bottom left, up on the top right is showing the revenues. Down on the bottom left, it's showing where the federal government spends its money. And so it's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and then this other, which is like unemployment insurance, like all these other earned income tax credits. So either retirement or other kind of social service programs. They call that mandatory spending.
Phil's favorite term.
Yeah, this is a little personal aside I have. I refuse to use that term. It's only mandatory because it's in law, but they can go and change the law. It's not like constitutionally mandatory or anything like that. But look at that chunk in the darker blue and gray. Like that's where the federal government spends most of its money. You see the net interest. That's what this debt concern is about, is that taking up an increasing share. But a lot of times what we think of as government, so defense, people know that. A lot of these programs that we think of in government are this little chunk right here, this 660 billion that it's talking about out of the 4.4 trillion. Like sometimes we think of this as government and this is like, oh, these are these other programs that we like or maybe don't like. And we think national defense is important. Anyway, a lot of sometimes like this general category of government that we think about is in this relatively small category right here.
It's a great graphic, Phil. So thanks for sharing. Well, where I wanted to go next is just, ask the question because a questioner's brought it up, but there's a general term we think of as budget sequestration. And, I think of it as including everything from the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act way back when to the PAYGO time, pay-as-you-go, budget control acts. And basically the idea is that the federal government's tried to do things to limit spending. And the person is asking, has budget sequestration had any impact on these trends at all? You want to tackle that one?
In the, maybe in the detailed picture, that could be a yes. In the big picture, I don't think it has. And I don't think those kinds of things would work. Phil pointed out a good point, and that is these taxes that we pay into the revenue pie chart that he was showing there. Government in the big picture is really quite simple. We tax our citizens to provide revenue for government to provide programs that we, the people, want. And that's incredibly simplistic, but I think it's pretty darn accurate. And so we have decided that we want these social service programs to take care of people. And as Phil pointed out, the single biggest program right now is Social Security, which is an incredibly popular program. Medicare is popular. Medicaid's not as popular among the people as a whole because it goes to people that are substantially non-voters, and they can't speak as loudly for themselves as AARP can, for example. But the bottom line, I think, is this, Natalie, is that we love our programs for the most part. Now, I hate some programs, Phil hates some programs. There are programs that some of us don't like, and we want our federal budget balanced on the programs we don't like. We don't want the federal budget balanced on programs we like. And so it's very difficult for a politician to balance our budget through cuts. I just don't see that happening. And that's what all these kind of programs try to do, is some kind of mandatory cuts. We're not going to balance the budget through cuts. So what are the other alternatives? Well, the most logical alternative is tax increases. If we don't want to cut programs, then let's raise taxes. Well, how popular is it to raise taxes? We had a strong economy in President Trump's administration, and yet he still cut taxes, adding to a deficit $1.9 trillion, if I remember right, that tax cut. We didn't need a tax cut in that sense. What we needed to do is work on balancing the budget, as Phil just pointed out. So it's really difficult for any politician, Republican or Democrat, to raise taxes. So we're not going to balance the budget by raising taxes. We're not going to balance the budget by cutting programs. What's left? There are some things you could do. You could just print money. You could demonetize the dollar, but those are not very good programs. They have their own serious problems. So I think unless there's a significant decision among Americans as a whole that something is seriously wrong, we aren't going to do much in addressing that deficit.
Phil, invite you to.
Yeah,
Dan.
if I can follow up on that. So, this time period here, when ARA was in place, that was about 7% of GDP compared to 1 year's GDP. It kind of took place over a couple of years. So let's say, maybe 3.5%, somewhere in there per year, was the kind of the one-time short-term ARA increases. And so, it was somewhere around 19 to 20% of GDP before you have ARA. So that maybe puts it here. And so maybe not having done deep econometric work, but just kind of looking at it here generically, some of the impacts of the sequestration, kind of the post-Great Recession limits in government growth were, maybe a percentage point, maybe 2, somewhere in that range in terms of reduction. So it's, certainly there's, I wouldn't say there's no impact, but it's also not a major impact, as Mike pointed out, right? And then as you'll see, this is kind of the new long-term baseline. This is the pandemic impacts, the aftermath of all of that was oh, we're tired of doing this. We want to go spend more money again, and kind of back on that longer term trajectory. And it is one of those things, it's a matter of managing the growth. I other than relatively small pieces, I think it's hard to do actual year-over-year cuts, but I think it's a matter of managing the growth rates and trying to get those more in line with economic growth.
Great, thank you, Phil. We've got another comment, and maybe there's some definitional things here to talk about, but the individual's asking, can Phil or Mike comment about indirect employment growth in government? Here, the questioner is referring to contractors, grants, research, or even foreign investment. Has indirect employment also seen large levels of growth?
I can be real quick on that. I suspect Phil could tell you that more directly at the state level because he was the budget director. But yeah, the state of Utah does a lot of its expenditures are contract expenditures. Our highway system is not constructed by government employees. Our highway system is bid out. I mean, our highway repairs and development is bid out to the private sector, and they build our highways. That's millions of dollars every year, hundreds of millions of dollars, and that is a completely private sector construction project. Same thing with our buildings at the universities. That's all done by the private sector. We have the money. I mean, government has the money. They make bids. Lowest bid generally gets the project, and so there is indirect employment for sure. Consulting companies, engineering consulting companies, for example, a large part of their consulting projects are with government, whether it be with the Department of Water Resources, Water Rights, transportation, and so on. So there's just a lot of indirect employment going on in the state of Utah.
Yeah, and on the state level specifically, to talk about, we had fewer employees. I think it was the last year of Governor Herbert's time in office than we did 20 years prior, right? So part of that, again, relates to the composition of what government's spending money on. Like if I had to choose between employment and spending, I definitely think spending is a better indicator because it does pick up these other pieces that are missed in a direct employment number. But government does, especially healthcare services, transportation services, government does contract fairly extensively. It always makes me laugh when I hear somebody kind of talk about the person holding the transportation person holding the flag at the side of the road in some construction site, and shouldn't that person be working? And I go back to two things. One, like safety is actually an important thing, and I care about that. But beyond that, that person is probably employed by a private contractor, not directly by government.
Yeah. All right, here's a great question, Phil, and we'll stay with you. I know Mike will have something to say as well, but we often have Utah cited as a very well-managed state, even the best managed state. What would you cite as the top level reasons for this? Is it balanced budget? Is it how our state and local governments are structured? What's behind this reputation we have as the best managed state?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I do think it's kind of a bunch of factors that come together. So there's not any single factor. Part of it, I think, is our economic condition. Like it's a lot easier to be the best managed state when you're dealing with growth. I'd meet with budget officers from around the country when a state's experiencing declining population. That is a hard thing to deal with. That's hard, and even flat growth that a lot of states are experiencing, that's hard to deal with. So I think a piece of it's the economic condition. Certainly a strong part of it is, I think, a culture around that, and it's kind of maybe a nebulous thing to talk about, but a culture of caring about fiscal responsibility, a culture of like trying to think long term. I'm not going to argue that we always 100% do everything right, but I think there's kind of a long-term intentionality around things that tends to drive a lot of policy decisions. So first of all, I agree that we are one of the best managed states. And again, I think there are a lot of reasons for that.
Just a couple of quick comments.
Yeah.
I think Phil hit it pretty much on the head on that. I would just add a few other things like that. The state does some things that help, I think, this culture that Phil talked about. We have a team that comes together from the legislature and the executive branch to come up with revenue forecasts and budget numbers that are agreed upon. So what you're dealing with is a number that both the legislature, when they budget, and the governor, when they budget, they're budgeting from the same number. There are states in where the legislature has their own number and the governor has his own number. And you spend half the time battling on how much money you have. The state does this, I think, very, very well. On top of that, there are, I think, on the whole, good planning organizations in the state of Utah that try to look down the road. It's legislators, bless their heart. I worked for them for 20 years and I love them, but they have a real serious challenge to look down the road very far when they've got election coming up in 18 months or something like that, you know, and that's a challenge. But we do have some long-term planning organizations together that I think that help a lot. They're at the local level, they're regionally, and they're at the state level. I think those kinds of things help. I think the fact that we have a constitutional limit on how much money we can borrow, it's 1.5% of the total value of property in the state of Utah, of taxable property in the state of Utah, that prevents us from getting too carried away with borrowing. And I think that's had a big factor, certainly not the only factor, but a big factor, and that's having a AAA bond rating, which allows us to borrow money at a very, very, very low rate. All those kinds of things, I think, are helpful.
Can I just jump in, take another bite of the apple here on that? One of the important things, so I started my career in California, and I think it's easy to like cast aspersions at California and whatever, but they do have a different constitutional structure, and a lot of their initiatives have like hamstrung the ability to manage the budget appropriately. And so that's another piece that I think is an important part of it is our constitutional structure and the flexibility that's there. And then the other piece related to that, policy decisions within that framework to try to maintain budget flexibility, where again, when I worked in California, you had all this mandated spending. And so you controlled a relatively small share of the budget. And a lot of this was written into the Constitution itself, not just into statute that the legislature could change. The thing I worry about here in Utah is when I see us doing earmarks and other things, like you wonder why the federal government's in the situation that it is because it earmarks money for certain purposes. Yeah. We're certainly not the same direction that California is, and we have the statutory ability to change it because it's not embedded in the Constitution. But I think maintaining long-term budget flexibility is an important component of that.
Very good. Well, we're down to the last few minutes here, so I've got one more question for you, and I'm going to kind of blend it with one that's on my mind and one that's come in, but it deals with the future, deals with what's next. And, you know, we've shown, particularly at the federal level, that as society has changed, we've demanded more from government, more education, more healthcare. We've got an aging population that's going to change things. We also have climate change and the need to invest more in, you know, the things that will reduce carbon emissions, and that could place a growth pressures on government. So the question is, over the next, 10 years or so, what should government be focused on to expand government in an efficient way? You know, we've got aging population, we've got all these pressures that we ask more from government. What could we do either at the federal, state level, both, however you two want to address it, to expand, to meet the needs of the population in an efficient way. And Phil, I'm going to let you go first, so we give Mike the last word as the author of our report.
Yeah, that's great. So a couple of things that I think are critical in terms of what government should be focused on. One, I'm going to give like a high level. We need to seriously like articulate what it is we're trying to achieve. Like if you don't know the goal, kind of more than just directionally, I think it's really hard to achieve the outcomes you want. Another is, I think we're going to have a very significant opportunity over the next decade to invest in K-12 education. We're on this from a demographic standpoint, we're on this downhill side of the baby boomer echo boom 2. And so we're over the past 10 to 15 years, a lot of significant amounts, increases in education funding have gone just to keep up with the growth. The projections are going forward, the next decade or so is not necessarily going to be the same way. And so that's where I think there is a very significant opportunity to invest in education, which in my view is an area where we have underinvested historically. But the other piece I want to add to that is that investment needs to translate to outcomes. So we need to be thinking about what specific outcomes do we want to achieve with that increased spending. And then just the final piece, I'll wrap up. You mentioned climate change, air quality issues. I think we have a lot of tools that are underutilized that we could utilize more, like user fees, thinking about user fees for water, thinking about user fees for transportation, where you look where we've gone over the last 50 years that we had in the report we put out last year on this. We haven't abandoned the principle of user pays, but we've shifted away from it in very significant ways. And that's something I think should be revisited.
Very good. Mike.
That's obviously a great question to end on. And I want to substantially agree with Phil. I think as I look at where we're spending our money, where we have spent our money, we still need to focus on improving our educational system. And you always hear, well, throwing money at something doesn't always do the job. And that's true, but without spending money on, you're certainly not going to get the job done. So I just think, as Phil pointed out, we've got a window here with slower growth in student populations to really invest in education. It's one thing to be below the national average in per pupil expenditures, for example. It's an entirely different thing to be at the bottom. And that's where we are. And the legislature, again, bless their heart, they try to put as much education money in as they can, but they're doing it without looking at other sources. You can't shift money from any of the other departments in the size enough to make a difference in education. You have to raise more money. And so I think we just need a real discussion about some tax increases if we truly want to fund education. Now, I'm saying that for myself, for all you listening, that's not a Gardner Institute position, but I think we need to have that discussion. The Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce has talked about it. We have got to get our funding level up if we're going to be competitive in an incredibly competitive world.
Well, that concludes our Newsmaker breakfast this morning. Thank you so much, Mike and Phil. I want to reference this report that you will see on our website later today about this topic, authored by Mike Christensen and Max Becker. I want to thank Paul Springer, Jennifer Robinson for all of their help clearing this report, getting it done, and others who have reviewed it. A special thank you to all of you for joining us. And our next Newsmaker breakfast will be Wednesday, March 9th. Stay tuned for further details. We have a great one coming for you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.
Bye-bye.